When the job goes sideways, alliances fracture, secrets surface, and violence erupts. Midland Heist. A Texas crime thriller. Chapter 1. You still know how to drive? Mac Torres looked at Eddie across the motel room table and smiled without showing teeth. 3 tours hauling supply through Anbar province. You asking me if I can drive? I'm asking if you remember how to drive scared. Driving when it matters. Mac's smile stayed where it was. I remember. They sat in room 14 at the Desert Rose Motor Inn on the east edge of Midland, which was the kind of place where the desk clerk took cash and wrote a name in a ledger without checking whether the name matched the face, and where the pool had been empty since 2019 and nobody had bothered to fill it. The room smelled of cigarettes, an industrial carpet cleaner, and the particular staleness of air conditioning that has been running for years without fresh air. Eddie had paid for 3 nights under a name that belonged to no one. He'd arrived at 9 in the morning. Mac had arrived at 10. The table between them held a road map of West Texas, a yellow legal pad with Eddie's handwriting on it, and a coffee in a styrofoam cup that Eddie had bought from the gas station next door and that had gone cold while they talked. Eddie said, "The job's a bank. Odessa. 3rd Friday in June. How much? 2 to 400,000. Depends on the week. I'm calling it 3. Mac looked at the legal pad. He looked at Eddie. What's my cut? 20%. 60,000, give or take. Who else is in? Tech guy. Electronics, cameras, alarms. You don't know him. And one more, I'll tell you about when he gets here. Cop. Eddie did not answer immediately. Mac read the silence. Cop, Mac said. Not a question this time. Detective. Ector County Sheriff. He's got access we need. You trust him? No. But you're bringing him in. I'm bringing him in because he's already halfway in. He knows I'm planning something, and he knows I'll need someone with a badge when it happens. Better to have him inside where I can see him than outside where I can't. Mac thought about this. He picked up the cold coffee and drank it anyway because waste was waste. What do you need from me? Wheels. You drive the chase vehicle. You're half a mile back when we hit the bank. You move when I call. You've got the engine and the nerve to get us clear when things go loud. They going loud? They always go loud, Eddie said. The question is when. Mac stood. He walked to the window and pulled the curtain back an inch and looked at the parking lot and at his truck, a 2015 Silverado, dark blue, the kind of blue that photographs gray in security camera footage, which was why Mac had chosen it. He'd bought the truck from a dealer in El Paso with cash from a job in 2022 and had put another $18,000 into the engine and suspension and the supercharger that made it run like something with twice the displacement. I'm in, Mac said. Eddie opened a manila envelope and pulled out $600 in 20s and 50s. He counted out 300 and slid it across the table. Walk around money. Another 3 when we meet next week. The rest when the job's done. Mac took the cash. He folded it once and put it in his front pocket without counting it. When do I meet the others? You don't. You meet me. That's the structure. Mac looked at Eddie. He looked at him the way you look at a man when you're deciding whether to say the thing you're thinking or keep it to yourself. He decided to say it. Huntsville, you told me when you got out you were done. You said one more stretch would kill you. I lied, Eddie said. To me or to yourself? Both. Mac went to the door. He opened it. The June heat came in like something solid. See you next week, he said, and left. Luis Salazar arrived at 11:30 in a white Honda Accord that had 140,000 miles on it and a bumper sticker from a San Antonio tech conference that was 3 years out of date. He parked next to a dumpster at the back of the lot and came to room 14, carrying a laptop bag and a backpack and the focused expression of a man who has driven 2 hours on bad coffee and is operating at about 70%. Eddie let him in. Luis set the laptop bag on the bed and the backpack on the floor and looked around the room with the assessing quality of someone cataloging exits and sightlines out of professional habit. "You want coffee?" Eddie said. "I want to know what I'm doing here." Eddie handed him the legal pad. Luis read it. He read the 3 pages Eddie had written. Notes, timelines, the bank's address, the security contractor's name, the branch manager's name, the assistant manager's name. Luis said, "You're hitting First National." "Yes." "The West University branch." "Yes." "You know, they upgraded security in 2016. Full IP camera system, remote monitoring, silent alarm tied to 3 different dispatch centers." "I know," Eddie said. "That's why you're here." Luis sat on the bed. He opened the laptop bag and pulled out a Dell that looked like it had been issued to him by someone who believed in fiscal responsibility over performance. He opened it. The desktop background was a photograph of the Golden Gate Bridge that had come preloaded with the operating system, and that Luis had never changed because changing it seemed like the kind of personal touch that made a machine identifiable. He pulled up a file. "I looked at their system last week. Ran a pen test on their public-facing network. Got in through a phishing email to the branch manager's assistant. Sent her a DocuSign request for a lease renewal. She clicked it. I had her credentials." "What did you find?" "The camera feeds go to a local DVR and to a cloud backup service called SecureView. The DVR's in a closet behind the teller line. The cloud backup runs on a 30-second delay. If you're in and out in under 30 seconds, the cloud never gets a clean image. We're not going to be in and out in 30 seconds. I know. Which is why you need to cut the internet before you go in. Cut the internet, the cloud backup stops receiving, the local DVR keeps recording, but the local DVR is something you can walk out with if you've got the time." Eddie thought about this. What about the silent alarm? That's the problem. The silent alarm doesn't run through the internet. It's a hard line to the security company and to county dispatch. You trip it, they know in under 10 seconds. So we don't trip it. Or you trip it, and you're gone before the response time catches up. Luis looked at the legal pad. "You said 3rd Friday in June. That's 13 days. "Yes." "You got a crew." "I've got muscle and wheels. I've got you. And I've got someone on the inside." "Inside the bank?" "Inside the sheriff's department." Luis closed the laptop. He looked at Eddie with the particular stillness of a man processing a variable he does not like. "You brought a cop into this." "I brought a cop into this," Eddie said. "Why?" "Because he can tell us response times, rotation schedules, which deputies call in sick, which ones don't. Because he can delay a dispatch if we need 30 extra seconds. Because he's already dirty, and dirty people are easier to work with than clean ones. Dirty people are easier to work with until they decide you're the problem," Luis said. "I know. And you're doing it anyway." "I'm doing it anyway." Luis picked up the backpack. He opened it and pulled out a small black box about the size of a deck of cards with 2 antennas and a micro USB port. "This is a cellular jammer. 3-block radius. Kills cell signals, kills data. You turn this on when you go in the bank. Nobody's calling anybody, nothing's going to the cloud." Eddie took the jammer. He turned it over in his hand. "This legal?" No. You use it before. Tested it in a parking lot in El Paso. Worked fine. Fried my own phone for 6 minutes until I turned it off. Eddie set the jammer on the table. What's your cut? 20%. You talked to Mac. I talked to Mac last week. He said you were putting something together. He said you'd call. Eddie opened the manila envelope and counted out $300 in cash. Luis took it and put it in his front pocket. Next week, I want to walk the bank. See the layout. Time the teller transactions, count the security cameras, check the sight lines. You do it Friday afternoon. You go in as a customer. You deposit a check, you fill out a withdrawal slip, you take your time. You film everything on your phone. What if they ask why I'm filming? They won't. Nobody looks at a man with a phone anymore. Phones are invisible. Luis stood. He picked up the laptop bag and the backpack and went to the door and stopped. Eddie. Yeah. This cop. You trust him with your life? No. You trust him with mine? Eddie looked at Luis and thought about the question, and about the true answer, and about whether the true answer was the answer Luis needed to hear. He decided it was. No, Eddie said. Luis nodded like this was what he'd expected. He left. Ray Holloway arrived at 2 in the afternoon in an unmarked Crown Victoria that had 190,000 miles on it, and the particular worn-in quality of a vehicle that has been driven hard for years by people who do not own it. He parked in the lot and sat in the car for 2 minutes with the engine running and the air conditioning on, and Eddie watched him through the curtain and thought about what Holloway was doing, which was scanning the lot for anything that looked wrong, which was what cops did when they arrived somewhere they should not be. Holloway got out. He wore jeans and a polo shirt and a Glock on his hip in an inside-the-waistband holster that his shirt did not quite cover. He came to room 14 and knocked twice. Eddie opened the door. Holloway came in and looked around the room the way cops look around rooms, cataloging, assessing, deciding whether this is a place that will become a problem later. He appeared satisfied that it would not. He sat in the chair by the window. You want something to drink? Eddie said. I want to know why I'm here. I've got a job. I need someone who knows how Ector County Sheriff runs their rotations. What kind of job? The kind where response time matters. Holloway smiled. It was the kind of smile a man smiles when he's been waiting for a conversation to arrive at a specific place, and it has just arrived there. You're hitting something. I'm hitting something, Eddie said. What? A bank. Odessa. First National, West University branch. Holloway stopped smiling. That's in the city. Odessa PD jurisdiction. The bank's in the city. The routes out are county roads. The safe house is county. If something goes wrong, and we need to move fast, we're in your territory in under 4 minutes. Holloway thought about this. He had the face of a man who had spent 20 years making calculations that involved risk and reward, and that had trained him to see both clearly. What's the take? 300,000. Maybe more. How many people? 4, including you. What's my cut? 25%. Holloway shook his head. 40. No. I'm bringing access you can't get anywhere else. I'm bringing coverage if something goes sideways. 40%. Eddie leaned back against the table. He looked at Holloway and thought about the math and about what 40% meant for Mac and Luis and what it meant for him. He thought about whether the access Holloway brought was worth the percentage and whether there was a version of this job that worked without Holloway, and decided there was not. 25, Eddie said. Plus a favor I call in later. What favor? I don't know yet. When I need it, I'll call it. Holloway looked at Eddie for a moment. He appeared to be running the same calculation Eddie had just run, working through the scenarios, deciding whether an undefined future favor was worth the percentage he was giving up. He appeared to decide it was not, which told Eddie that Holloway believed the favor would never be called, or that if it was called, it would be the kind of favor Holloway could decline. Holloway was wrong on both counts, but he did not know this yet. Deal, Holloway said. Eddie opened the manila envelope and counted out $600 in cash. Holloway took it and put it in his front pocket without counting it, which was what Mac had done and what Luis had done, and which told Eddie something about the men he was working with, which was that they trusted him, or that they were pretending to trust him, or that they had decided that counting the money in front of him communicated something they did not want to communicate. What do you need from me? Holloway said. Response times. I need to know how long it takes a unit to get from the nearest station to the West University branch. I need to know which deputies are on rotation that Friday. I need to know which ones call in sick regular, which ones don't. That's easy. I need you to be somewhere else when the call comes in. Somewhere with witnesses. Somewhere that puts you 40 minutes away from the bank. That's harder. That's why you're getting 25%. Holloway stood. He went to the door and put his hand on the knob and stopped. Eddie. Yeah. This thing at the Cactus Rose. Your girl. Eddie looked at him. She's something, Holloway said. She's with me. I know, Holloway said. He said it in a way that suggested he knew, and that knowing did not change anything, and that Eddie should understand this without Holloway having to say it directly. I'm just saying she's something. He left. Eddie stood in room 14 and looked at the closed door and thought about Carmen and Holloway and the way Holloway had looked at her the first night at the Cactus Rose and every night since. He thought about whether bringing Holloway into the job was the right decision, or whether it was a decision that felt right because all the other options felt wrong. He decided it did not matter. The decision had been made. Eddie drove back to Odessa in the afternoon heat with the air conditioning in his truck running at maximum and producing the kind of marginal cooling that old trucks produce when the compressor has been complaining for a year. He drove Highway 158 west through the oil fields and the pump jacks and the flat empty that West Texas does better than anywhere. And he thought about the crew and the percentages and whether the math worked. It worked if nothing went wrong. He pulled into the carport at the rental house on the east side of Odessa at 4:30. The house was a single-story stucco built in the 80s, beige, flat roof, a dead lawn that nobody watered, and a carport that held the '68 Charger under a blue tarp. Carmen's white Civic was in the driveway. Eddie went inside. Carmen was on the couch with a book. She looked up when he came in. She had dark hair pulled back, and sharp features, and the kind of face that looked better in person than in photographs because photographs did not catch the thing about her that made men notice, which was not beauty exactly but presence, the way certain people are just more there than other people. How'd it go? She said. Good. You get your crew? I got my crew. She set the book down. You want to tell me about it? No. You going to tell me anything? When it's done. Carmen stood. She walked to the kitchen and came back with a beer and handed it to him. He drank it. She watched him drink it with the expression of someone who is waiting for a thing to be said that is not being said and who has decided not to say it first. Ray came by the bar last night, she said. Eddie looked at her. What did he want? He wanted to talk. About what? You. The job. Whether I knew what you were planning. What did you tell him? I told him I don't ask questions I don't want answers to. Eddie finished the beer. He went to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator and looked at what was in it. More beer, leftover Chinese food from 3 days ago, a gallon of milk that was probably fine, and decided he did not want any of it. He came back to the living room. Carmen was standing by the window, looking at the street. The afternoon light came through the curtain and hit her face and made her look younger than she was, which was 36, which was 6 years younger than Eddie, and old enough to have made decisions she regretted, and young enough to believe she could still walk them back. You like him, Eddie said. Carmen turned around. What? Ray. You like him? I talked to him. He comes into the bar, he's friendly, we talk. That's what bartenders do. That's not what I asked. Carmen looked at Eddie with the level assessment of someone who has just been asked a question they do not want to answer, and who is deciding whether answering it honestly or dishonestly produces better outcomes. She appeared to decide that honesty was the only option that would close the conversation. He's interesting, she said. He's got stories. He's been places. He's a cop. He's a cop who's working with you, so I don't know what moral high ground you think you're standing on right now. Eddie went to the couch and sat. He put his head back and closed his eyes and thought about the crew and the job and the thing Holloway had said at the door, she's something, and whether that thing had been a statement or a warning or an invitation. Carmen sat next to him. She did not touch him. She sat close enough that he could feel her there, but far enough that the not touching communicated something specific, which was distance, which was the thing they had been building between them for 6 months without acknowledging they were building it. When's the job? She said. 2 weeks. You need anything from me? I need you to not ask questions. I can do that. And I need you to stay away from Ray. Carmen looked at him. She looked at him, the way you look at someone when they have just asked for something you do not want to give, and you are deciding whether giving it is worth the cost of the argument that follows if you don't. Okay, she said. Eddie opened his eyes. He looked at her. Okay. Okay. He did not believe her, but he did not say he did not believe her, because saying it would produce a conversation that would not end well, and that would not change the outcome. They ran the plan 3 times. The first time was the following Friday in the motel room in Midland, with Eddie calling positions and Mac timing routes and Luis reading camera angles off his phone. They walked through the sequence from arrival to vault to exit, and Eddie timed it at 4 minutes and 38 seconds, which was too long. The second time was the Monday after, same room, same sequence, and Eddie cut it to 3 minutes and 52 seconds by eliminating the teller interaction and going straight to the vault. The third time was Wednesday, and they had it down to 3 minutes and 18 seconds, which was tight but workable if nothing went wrong. Holloway provided the blind spots. He came to the motel on Thursday with a printed map of the bank's interior and a list of camera positions and which angles the security guard could not see from his desk at the entrance. He pointed to the manager's office. This camera here feeds to the main monitor. But the guard can't see the monitor from where he sits unless he stands up, and he doesn't stand up unless someone makes him. How do you know? Luis said. Because I've been in that bank 6 times in the past month, and I've watched him. He sits, he looks at his phone, he stands when someone needs directions to the bathroom. Mac drove the perimeter. He timed the routes from the bank to the industrial lot behind the HVAC warehouse where they would ditch the first vehicle. He timed the routes from the lot to the highway. He timed the routes from the highway to the safe house in Fort Stockton. He came back to the motel with a legal pad full of numbers and told Eddie it would work if the traffic was light, and it would not work if the traffic was heavy, and there was no way to know which it would be until the day of. Luis walked the bank on Friday afternoon. He went in as a customer with a check to deposit and a phone in his shirt pocket, filming everything. He stood in line. He waited. He watched the teller transactions and counted the cameras and checked the sight lines from the security guard's desk. He came back to the motel with 12 minutes of footage and a map he'd drawn on a napkin that showed every camera angle and every blind spot and the location of the vault door relative to the entrance. Eddie watched the footage 3 times. He froze it on the vault door. The door was steel, time-locked, the kind of door that required 2 keys to open during operational hours, and that could not be opened at all outside those hours without the override code, which was held by the branch manager and the regional security director and no one else. "The keys," Eddie said. "Where are they?" "Manager's desk," Luis said. "Lockbox. I can open it." "How long?" 40 seconds. Maybe less. "Do it in 30. "I'll do my best." "Do it in 30, Eddie said again. The night before the job, Eddie lay in bed next to Carmen and stared at the ceiling and thought about the sequence and the timing and whether 3 minutes and 18 seconds was fast enough. Carmen was not asleep. He could tell from her breathing. She lay on her side facing away from him, and he could feel the space between them in the bed, which was 8 inches and expanding. "You awake?" Carmen said. "Yeah." "You nervous?" "No." "You're lying." Eddie did not argue. She was right. Carmen rolled over. She looked at him. The streetlight from outside came through the curtain and hit her face, and he could see her eyes in the dark. "It's going to be fine," she said. "You don't know that." "I know you. You plan things. You don't do things that aren't going to work. I did 3 years in Huntsville for something I thought was going to work. That was different." "How?" "You're older now. You're smarter." Eddie looked at the ceiling. "I'm older. I don't know about smarter." Carmen leaned over and kissed him. She kissed him longer than usual, softer, with something in it that felt different than the kisses that had come before. Eddie registered this. He registered it, but did not fully process what it meant, which was that the kiss had the quality of a thing ending rather than a thing continuing, which was the quality of goodbye. She pulled back. "Be careful tomorrow," she said. "I'm always careful." "Be more careful than always." She rolled over and went to sleep, or pretended to go to sleep. And Eddie lay in the dark and thought about the crew and the bank and the vault and the 3 minutes and 18 seconds, and whether the kiss had meant what he thought it meant, or whether he was reading things into it that were not there because he was nervous, and nervous people read things into everything. He decided he was reading things into it. He decided wrong, but he would not know this until it was too late to matter. Chapter 2. The white panel van came off West University Boulevard into the First National Bank parking lot at 2:07 p.m. on a Friday afternoon when the temperature was 108 degrees and the West Texas sun had turned the asphalt into something that gave under your feet if you stood on it long enough. Eddie drove. Luis rode passenger. The van had quality plumbing stenciled on both sides in blue letters and a Midland phone number that went to a voicemail box that had been full since 2019 when the plumbing contractor had gone out of business and sold the van to a wholesaler who had sold it to someone else who had parked it behind a storage facility in East Midland where Mac had found it 3 days ago and driven it away at 2 in the morning with plates he'd taken off a similar van in an airport long-term lot. Eddie pulled into a space near the entrance. Not too close, not too far. Close enough to move fast. Far enough that the security camera over the door caught the van at an angle that made the plates hard to read. He turned off the engine. The air conditioning died. The heat came in immediately. "You good?" Eddie said. Luis looked at the bank entrance. He looked at the security camera. He looked at his hands, which were steady. "I'm good." 41 seconds on the lockbox. "That's what you said." "That's what I said." "Make it 30. "I'll make it what I can make it." Eddie picked up the two-way radio from the console between them and keyed it. "Mac." The radio crackled. Mac's voice came through compressed and flat. "I'm here." "Half a mile." "Half a mile." "We're going in." 3 minutes. "You move when I call." "Copy." Eddie clipped the radio to his belt under the polo shirt. He picked up the toolbox from the floor behind his seat, a gray plastic Stanley with a rusty latch and the weight of something that had tools in it, which it did, plus a Glock 17, zip ties, and a second two-way radio. Luis picked up his toolbox. They got out. The heat hit them like a wall. Eddie had been in West Texas his entire life, and the heat still surprised him every time he stepped into it, which was the thing about 108 degrees. It did not matter how many times you experienced it. It remained unnatural, something the body rejected. They walked to the entrance. Eddie pulled the door open. The air conditioning inside was aggressive and chemical, and smelled of recycled air and carpet cleaner. Luis went in first. Eddie followed. The security guard sat at a desk to the right of the entrance. A man in his 50s, gray uniform, a name tag that said Mitchell, a phone in his hand showing a football game or a highlight reel or something that held his attention more completely than two men in polo shirts carrying toolboxes. The guard looked up. He looked at Eddie. He looked at Luis. He looked at the toolboxes. He returned his attention to the phone. Eddie and Luis walked past him into the main banking area. The branch layout matched the footage Luis had filmed the week before. The teller line ran along the left wall. 5 stations, 3 of them occupied, customers waiting. The manager's office was in the back right corner, behind a glass partition. The vault was behind the teller line, visible through a doorway. The door open. The time lock disengaged because it was 2:07 p.m. and the operational window ran from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eddie moved toward the vault. Luis moved toward the manager's office. They moved with the unhurried purpose of technicians who have been called to fix something and who know where the something is. Nobody looked at them. People in banks do not look at technicians. Technicians are invisible. Luis reached the manager's office. The door was open. The office was empty, except for a desk and 2 chairs, and a woman sitting at the desk with a stack of forms in front of her. She looked up when Luis came in. She had dark hair pulled back, and the tired expression of someone who has been filling out forms for 2 hours and has not yet reached the bottom of the stack. "Can I help you?" she said. Luis closed the door behind him. He set the toolbox on the desk and opened it and pulled out the Glock 19 and held it at his side, not pointing it at her, just showing it to her in the way that makes the showing enough. "Stand up," Luis said. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." The woman looked at the gun. She looked at Luis. Her face did the thing faces do when the situation changes from normal to not normal, and the brain has not yet caught up with the eyes. She stood. She turned around. Her breathing changed, shallow, fast, the body's panic response kicking in before thought. "What's your name?" Luis said. "Teresa." "Teresa, I need you to stay calm. I need you to do what I tell you. If you do that, this will be over in 3 minutes and nobody gets hurt." Teresa nodded. Her hands were shaking. Luis pulled a zip tie from his pocket and secured her wrists behind her back. He walked her to the manager's chair and sat her down. He turned to the desk and opened the bottom drawer and found the lockbox, a small metal box with a combination lock, the kind you buy at an office supply store, and that keeps out casual thieves and no one else. He pulled the tension wrench and pick from his pocket. He'd practiced this on an identical lockbox he'd bought at Office Max in El Paso, and he'd opened it in 37 seconds after an hour of practice, and in 22 seconds after a day of practice, and he'd told Eddie 41 because 41 gave him buffer, and Eddie had told him to make it 30, and Luis had said he'd make it what he could make it. He made it in 33. The lockbox opened. Inside, 2 keys on a ring, a ledger with security codes written in pencil, and a checkbook. Luis took the keys. He left everything else. He looked at Teresa. "You're doing fine," he said. "Stay here. Don't move. Don't try to get out of the chair. Someone will find you in a few minutes." Teresa said nothing. Her breathing was still fast. Her eyes were wide. Luis recognized the look, which was the look of someone who has just experienced something that will replay in their mind for years and who has not yet fully processed that it is happening right now. He left the office and pulled the door closed behind him. Eddie reached the vault at 2:09. The door was open. The interior was a 10 by 12 room with steel shelves on 3 walls and a rolling cart in the center. The cart held 6 canvas bags stacked 2 high, each bag tagged with a contractor name and a deposit slip stapled to the handle. Permian Basin Services, West Texas Drilling, Lone Star Construction, Mesa Oil Field Supply, Rio Grande Contracting, Desert Pump and Motor. Eddie opened the first bag. Banded cash, 20s, 50s, 100s. He did not count it. He estimated 60,000 and moved to the next bag. Same. He looked at all 6 bags and did the math. 360,000, give or take. The take was heavy on the high end of the estimate, which was good. Except that heavy meant more weight, and more weight meant more time moving it, and more time was the thing they did not have. Eddie pulled the rolling equipment case from his toolbox, a black Pelican case with wheels and a telescoping handle, the kind that photographers use for lighting equipment. He loaded all 6 bags into the case. They fit with the handles folded down and the case zipped. The case was heavy. Eddie pulled the handle up and rolled it. The wheels moved. The weight was manageable. 2 minutes, 12 seconds since they'd walked in. Luis appeared at the vault door with the keys. He handed them to Eddie without speaking. Eddie took them and handed Luis the 2-way radio from his belt. "Tell Mac we're coming out," Eddie said. Luis keyed the radio. "Mac, we're at 2 minutes 15. Moving to the van now." The radio crackled. Mac's voice, "I'm rolling." Eddie pulled the equipment case toward the main banking area. Luis walked beside him. They moved at the same unhurried pace they'd used coming in. 2 technicians finishing a service call, tools packed, job done. They were 10 feet from the entrance when the front door opened and a man came in. The man was in his 60s, maybe older, lean in the way that men who have spent their lives outdoors are lean, the kind of lean that is not fitness but function. He wore a white Stetson with a cattleman's crease and a blue plaid shirt tucked into Wranglers and boots that had been resoled more than once. He carried a brown paper bag in his left hand, lunch probably, the grease stains on the bottom suggesting something fried. He looked at Eddie and Luis and the equipment case. He looked at them the way a man looks at something when he is processing information faster than he is showing, and when the information is producing a conclusion that the situation has not yet confirmed. He turned to leave. Eddie saw the turn. Eddie saw the man's shoulders shift, and his right hand drop toward his hip in the specific way that hands drop when they are reaching for something, and the something is a weapon. "Luis," Eddie said. Luis was already moving. He reached the man in 3 steps and put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Stop." The man stopped. He turned around. He looked at Luis, and at the Glock in Luis's right hand, and at Eddie coming up behind with the equipment case. And his face did not show surprise or fear, but something else, which was recognition, which was the face of a man who has been in this situation before from the other side, and who understands exactly what he is looking at. "You boys picked the wrong bank," the man said. His right hand kept moving. Luis saw the move. Eddie saw the move. The man's hand cleared his hip and pulled a Glock from an inside the waistband holster, and the barrel was coming up when Luis fired. The sound in the enclosed space was enormous. The gunshot hit the tile floor and the glass partition and the high ceiling, and bounced back and became louder than the gun that had produced it, became a sound that filled the entire room and everyone in it. The man went down. He went down hard, his back hitting the floor, the Stetson falling off and rolling across the tile. The paper bag hit the floor beside him and split open, and something wrapped in foil fell out, a burrito it looked like, or a sandwich. Luis stood over him with the Glock, and the specific frozen quality of a man who has just done something that cannot be undone, and who is still in the moment of doing it, and has not yet processed what follows. The man lay on the floor. His breathing was fast and shallow. His shirt was turning dark below the ribs. His right hand still held the Glock, but the hand had stopped moving, and the gun sat in it like something that had lost its purpose. Eddie looked at the man. He looked at Luis. He looked at the teller line where 3 tellers and 4 customers were standing frozen, and at the security guard at the entrance who had his phone in his hand now and was not looking at a football game but was looking at them. Eddie keyed the radio. "Mac, we got a problem. We're coming out now." Mac's voice came back immediately. "What problem?" "Shots fired. Move to the lot. 30 seconds. Eddie grabbed Luis by the shoulder. "We're leaving. Right now." Luis did not move. He stood looking at the man on the floor with the same frozen quality, the Glock still in his hand, his face showing nothing that Eddie could read except the processing, the working through, the thing that happens when someone crosses a line they have never crossed before. "Luis," Eddie said. Luis looked at him. "Now," Eddie said. Luis moved. They went to the entrance. The security guard, Mitchell, had the phone to his ear and was speaking into it, and Eddie pulled the Glock from under his polo shirt and pointed it at Mitchell and said, "Put the phone down." Mitchell looked at the gun. He looked at Eddie. He set the phone on the desk with the care of a man who has decided that his hourly wage does not cover being shot, and that compliance is the better option. "Stay there," Eddie said. "Don't move. Don't touch anything. Count to 100. Mitchell nodded. Eddie and Luis went through the front door, into the heat. The white panel van was where they'd left it. Mac's Silverado was pulling into the lot from the street, moving fast. Eddie opened the van's rear doors and threw the equipment case inside. Luis got in the passenger seat. Eddie got in the driver's seat and started the engine and backed out of the space in 3 seconds and pulled onto West University heading south. In the rearview mirror, Eddie saw Mac's Silverado fall in 3 cars back. He saw Mitchell come out of the bank entrance with his phone to his ear. He saw a customer, a woman in a business suit, come out after Mitchell and look at the van and point. Eddie turned right onto a side street. The van's tires squealed. He went 2 blocks and turned left into an alley behind a shuttered HVAC warehouse and pulled into the lot and stopped. The tan Ford Explorer was parked at the back of the lot, near a dumpster, exactly where Carmen had said it would be. Eddie had not asked Carmen where she got the Explorer, or who it was registered to, or whether it could be traced back to her, because asking those questions produced answers, and answers produced conversations, and conversations produced opportunities for things to go wrong. He'd asked her to get him a clean vehicle that could hold 6 bags, and that nobody would connect to him, and she'd gotten him this, and he'd decided that was enough. Mac pulled in behind the van. He got out and opened the Explorer's rear hatch. Eddie opened the van's rear doors and pulled out the equipment case, and Mac helped him lift it, and they transferred it to the Explorer. The 6 canvas bags went into the back. Eddie closed the hatch. Luis had not moved from the passenger seat of the van. He sat with his hands on his knees and his head forward, and the stillness of someone who is either going to be sick or is working very hard not to be sick. Eddie opened the passenger door. Luis, we're switching vehicles. Get in the Explorer. Luis looked at him. I shot him. I know. I didn't mean to shoot him. He was pulling a gun. You made the right call. He went down. He went down, Eddie said. And now we're leaving. Get in the Explorer. Luis got out. He walked to the Explorer like a man walking through water, each step requiring conscious effort. He got in the back seat. Eddie got in the driver's seat. Mac got in the passenger seat. Eddie started the engine. He looked at the white panel van sitting in the lot with the quality plumbing sign on the side, and the toolboxes still inside, and the forensic evidence that would lead somewhere eventually, but not today, and not tomorrow if they moved fast enough. He pulled out of the lot onto the alley and turned south toward the highway. They ran Highway 385 south out of Odessa at 73 miles per hour. Eddie kept the Explorer in the right lane. He watched the mirrors. He counted the vehicles behind them, 12 at the 2-mile mark, 9 at the 5-mile mark, 4 at the 10-mile mark, and by the time they passed the city limit sign, the highway had opened up, and there were 2 vehicles behind them, and neither one was a Silverado, and neither one had light bars. Mac's Silverado had gone west on a parallel route toward Monahan's. The plan was for Mac to take the long way to the safe house, west to Monahan's, then south on 18, then east on 67 through the emptiness between towns where highways run straight and traffic is sparse, and a truck doing 80 does not draw attention because everyone does 80 when the road allows it. Eddie would take 385 south, which was the more direct route, and the more exposed route, and the route that made sense for someone trying to put distance between themselves and a crime as fast as possible, which was what Eddie wanted anyone tracking them to think they were doing. Luis sat in the back seat and said nothing. He had said nothing since they'd left the lot. Eddie looked at him in the rearview mirror. Luis stared out the window at the desert running past. His hands were in his lap. His face showed nothing. Mac looked at Eddie. What happened in there? A customer came in. He saw us. He went for his gun. Luis shot him. Luis shot him. He dead? I don't know. Mac looked out at the highway. He looked at the desert on both sides, flat, empty, the pump jacks scattered across it like some kind of industrial crop. This changes things. I know. Armed robbery's one thing. If that man dies, it's something else. I know, Eddie said again. They drove. The Explorer's air conditioning ran at maximum and produced marginal cooling. The temperature outside was 108 and dropping slowly as the afternoon worked toward evening. The radio was off. Eddie had turned it off when they'd left the lot, because he did not want to hear the news and did not want to know what the news was saying about them until he had time to think about what the news meant. At the 20-mile mark, Eddie's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket. Carmen. He answered. I heard, Carmen said. What did you hear? Radio. Shots fired at First National. One down. They're not saying who. We're clear. We're heading south. Eddie. I'll call you when we're at the house. He ended the call. He put the phone back in his pocket. He looked at the highway and at the empty land on both sides and at the vehicles behind them in the mirror, still far back, neither one police. Mac said. She know where we're going? No. She know about the safe house? No. Good. Eddie looked at him. You don't trust her. I don't know her, Mac said. I trust you. I don't trust people I don't know. Eddie thought about this. He thought about Carmen, and the explorer, and the kiss the night before, and the thing in her voice when she'd said, "Be more careful than always." He thought about whether Mac was right not to trust her, and whether Eddie's trust was based on knowledge, or on the fact that Carmen was in his bed, and in his house, and in his life, in a way that made not trusting her feel like a betrayal of something. He decided it did not matter. They were committed now. The job was done. The money was in the back. Whatever came next would come, whether Carmen was trustworthy or not. He drove. They passed Fort Stockton at 4:23 p.m. The safe house was 12 miles south, on a dirt road that ran east from the highway through scrub brush and caliche, and the kind of empty that goes on until it hits Mexico. Eddie had rented the house from a man he'd known in Huntsville, a man named Vickers, who owned 3 properties in West Texas, and who rented them for cash to people who needed places to be that were not their names, and not their addresses, and not anywhere anyone would look. The road was unmarked. Eddie had driven it twice before, once to scout it, once to deliver the first month's rent in cash to Vickers, who had met him there, and handed him the key, and told him the house was his for as long as he paid, and that Vickers did not want to know what he was paying for. Eddie took the turn. The explorer handled the dirt road better than he'd expected. The road ran east for 2 miles, and then turned south and climbed a low rise, and on the far side of the rise the house appeared. Single-story ranch, stucco, flat roof, a cistern in the yard, a collapsed barn off to the east that had fallen in a windstorm and had not been rebuilt because rebuilding it would cost more than it was worth. The house had no neighbors. The nearest structure was a hunting cabin 4 miles west that was occupied 2 weeks a year during deer season and empty the rest. Eddie pulled into the dirt yard and stopped. He turned off the engine. The silence that followed was total. No traffic, no wind, nothing but the ticking of the engine cooling, and the heat pressing down on everything. Mac got out. Luis got out. Eddie got out. They stood in the yard and looked at the house and at the desert beyond it, and at the empty that went on in every direction, until it hit something that stopped it. "We're here," Eddie said. Mac opened the Explorer's rear hatch. He pulled out the equipment case and set it on the ground and unzipped it. The 6 canvas bags sat inside, the contractor names visible on the tags. Luis looked at the bags. He looked at Eddie. "How much?" $360,000, Eddie said. "Give or take." "That's a lot of money," Luis said. "It's a lot of money," Eddie agreed. "Is it worth it?" Eddie looked at Luis. He looked at Mac. He looked at the bags, and the house, and the desert, and the empty, and thought about the question, and about whether the question had an answer that would satisfy Luis, or whether the only answer was the one they were living right now. "We'll find out," Eddie said. He picked up the equipment case and carried it toward the house. Chapter 3. The interior of the safe house smelled of dust and heat and abandonment. Eddie unlocked the front door and pushed it open, and the smell came out like something that had been waiting. The living room held a couch with torn upholstery, and a coffee table made from a cable spool, and a television from the 90s that sat unplugged in the corner with its screen dark. The kitchen was visible through a doorway to the right, linoleum floor, Formica counter, a refrigerator that hummed when Eddie plugged it in, and that produced a sound suggesting it had opinions about being asked to work after sitting idle. Mac carried the equipment case inside and set it on the coffee table. Luis followed him in and stood near the door with his hands in his pockets and the expression of someone who is present but not participating, who has arrived at a place and has not yet decided whether the place is somewhere he wants to be. Eddie went to the kitchen and checked the refrigerator. Empty. He checked the cabinets. 1 can of black beans, 1 can of tomato soup, a box of crackers from a brand that no longer existed. He left them where they were. He came back to the living room. Mac had unzipped the equipment case and pulled out the 6 canvas bags and lined them up on the floor like soldiers on parade. The contractor names faced up: Permian Basin Services, West Texas Drilling, Lone Star Construction, Mesa Oil Field Supply, Rio Grande Contracting, Desert Pump and Motor. Eddie knelt beside the first bag and opened it. Banded cash, hundreds on top, 50s below that, 20s at the bottom. He pulled out a stack and fanned it. The bills were crisp, new, the kind that banks get in shipments from the Federal Reserve, and that smell of ink and paper and the specific chemical process that produces money. He did not count the stack. He estimated it at 5,000 and set it aside and pulled out another stack and estimated it the same, and did this 12 times until he'd gone through the entire bag. 60,000, Eddie said. This bag. Mac opened the second bag. Same here. Maybe more. Eddie stood. He looked at the 6 bags on the floor. 360,000 total. Call it 60 per person. That's if we split it even, Mac said. We split it even. What about Holloway? Holloway gets his cut when we're clear. Not before. Mac zipped the second bag closed. He looked at Eddie. You think he'll wait? No. So what do we do? We move the money tonight. We don't stay here. We take it somewhere Holloway doesn't know about, and we sit on it until the heat drops. How long? A week. Maybe 2. And then we split it, and we go our separate ways and we don't see each other again. Mac thought about this. He picked up one of the bags and tested its weight. 60,000. That's a lot to carry around. It's a lot to leave behind, Eddie said. Luis had not moved from his position near the door. He stood with his back against the wall and his hands still in his pockets and stared at the bags on the floor with the focused attention of someone looking at a thing and seeing something else. Eddie walked over to him. You all right? Luis did not answer immediately. He continued looking at the bags. Then the man at the bank. Don't. I shot him. I know you shot him. We all know you shot him. And we're not talking about it here. And we're not talking about it anywhere. It's done. He had a gun, Luis said. He had a gun, Eddie agreed. He was pulling it. He was pulling it. So I had to shoot him. Eddie looked at Luis. He looked at him, the way you look at someone who is working through something and who needs to work through it, but who needs to work through it somewhere that is not here and not now. You made the right call, Eddie said. He went for his gun. You shot him. If you'd waited, he shoots you or he shoots me, or he shoots someone in the bank, and then we've got hostages and SWAT, and the whole thing goes a different direction. But he's in surgery. That's what the news said. He's in surgery. Which means he's alive. Which means maybe he makes it, and maybe he doesn't. But right now he's alive, and you can't do anything about that except not talk about it. Luis looked at his hands. He pulled them from his pockets and held them in front of him and turned them over like he was seeing them for the first time. They're steady, he said. What? My hands. They're not shaking. I thought they'd shake. You want them to shake? I don't know. I thought that's what happened. When you shot someone, I thought your hands shook. Eddie thought about this. He thought about Huntsville and the things he'd seen there, and the conversations he'd had with men who had shot people and who had talked about it in the yard or in the chow line, or in the cells at night, when talking was the only thing that made the time move. He thought about what those men had said about their hands, and whether any of them had mentioned shaking. He decided they had not. "Your hands are fine," Eddie said. "You're fine. We're all fine. We did the job. We got the money. Now we move it, and we wait, and we don't talk about what happened at the bank until this is over." Luis nodded. He put his hands back in his pockets. He looked at the bags on the floor, and then looked away like the looking was something he needed to ration. Eddie's phone buzzed at 5:47 p.m. He pulled it from his pocket. Holloway. He looked at the screen. He looked at Mac. Mac was watching him. Eddie answered. "We got a problem," Holloway said. "What problem?" "Pierce is alive." Eddie looked at Luis. Luis was still standing by the door. He had not heard the conversation, but he saw Eddie looking at him, and his face changed in the way faces change when they understand that the thing they were afraid of has just been confirmed. "What do you mean alive?" Eddie said. "I mean, he's in surgery at Medical Center Hospital right now. I mean, they're saying he's got a chance. I mean, if he makes it, he's going to talk." "What's he going to say?" "He's going to describe you. He's going to describe Luis. He's going to tell them what he saw, and what he saw was two men with guns and a rolling case full of money walking out of First National Bank." Eddie walked to the window and looked out at the empty land beyond the house. The sun was low. The desert had turned orange in the late afternoon light. Nothing moved anywhere. "How long until he's out of surgery?" Eddie said. "I don't know. 3 hours. 4. They're not releasing information to anyone except family." "You got someone inside?" "I got a nurse I know. She's texting me updates. Last one said he's stable, but critical." Eddie thought about this. He thought about Pierce on the floor of the bank with his shirt turning dark, and his breathing fast and shallow, and the Stetson rolling across the tile. He thought about whether stable, but critical meant Pierce was likely to make it, or whether it meant doctors were saying things to family that made family feel better about outcomes that had not yet been decided. "Eddie," Holloway said. "Yeah. I need to know where you are." "You don't." "I need to know where the money is." "You don't need to know that either." There was a pause on the line. Eddie heard something in the background on Holloway's end. Voices maybe, or a television, or the ambient sound of a room with people in it. He could not tell what it was, but he could tell that Holloway was not alone, and that whoever else was in the room was close enough to hear if Holloway said something he should not say. "Eddie, listen to me," Holloway said. His voice had changed. The urgency was still there, but under it was something else, something harder. "If Pierce talks, this whole thing unravels. They'll have descriptions. They'll pull the security footage. They'll connect you to the van, and the van to the job, and the job to me. How do they connect it to you? Because I'm the one who delayed the dispatch. I'm the one who made sure the response time ran long. I'm the one who told you which cameras fed to which monitors and which ones stored local. I'm in this, Eddie. I'm in this, the same as you." Eddie said nothing. He let the silence sit. Holloway filled it. "I need to know where you are, so I can help you move the money. So we can get it somewhere safe, and split it before the investigation gets close. We're already somewhere safe." "Where?" "Somewhere you don't need to know about." Eddie. Eddie ended the call. He stood at the window and looked at the phone in his hand and thought about Holloway and Carmen and the question that had been building since the motel room in Midland, and that had just resolved into something he could no longer ignore. Holloway wanted the money. Holloway wanted the money, And Holloway knew Eddie had the money, and Holloway had resources Eddie did not have. Badge, access, the ability to move through West Texas without producing questions. Mac came over. What did he say? Pierce is in surgery. Might make it. What else? He wants to know where we are. You tell him? No. Mac looked at Eddie. He looked at him with the assessing quality of someone who has known you long enough to read the things you're not saying. You think he's coming for the money. I think he's already figured out where we might be. I think he's got 3 or 4 places that make sense, and he's working through them. I think Fort Stockton is on that list because it's the obvious place, south, empty, off the main routes. So we move. We move. Where? Eddie thought about this. He thought about the map of West Texas he'd studied for 3 weeks before the job, and about the roads and the towns and the places where a man could disappear for a few days without producing questions. He thought about east versus west, north versus south, and about which direction Holloway would expect and which direction Holloway would not. Odessa, Eddie said. You want to go back? I want to go back because it's the last place anyone looks. We hit a bank in Odessa and we run south, and everyone thinks we're in Mexico or headed that way. Nobody thinks we're at my house. What about Carmen? Eddie looked at Mac. Carmen, Mac said again. She's at your house. She knows you. She knows Holloway. You bring the money back to Odessa. You're putting it in a place where 2 people know where you are, and one of them's a cop. Eddie walked to the coffee table and looked at the 6 bags on the floor. He looked at them and did the math that Mac had just done and arrived at the same conclusion, which was that Carmen was a risk. Carmen had always been a risk. The question was whether the risk was manageable, or whether it had already moved past management into the territory of problems that could not be fixed. He thought about the kiss the night before the job. He thought about the thing in her voice when she'd called after the shooting. He thought about Holloway's hand on her shoulder at the Cactus Rose, and the way she'd leaned into the bar when Holloway sat down, and the way she'd said Ray's asking when she'd called from the road. I don't know, Eddie said. You don't know if you trust her, or you don't know what to do about it. Both. Mac picked up one of the canvas bags. He held it in both hands and tested its weight again, like he was deciding whether it was worth the risk Eddie was describing. He appeared to decide it was not. We can't go back to Odessa, Mac said. Not with the money. Not until we know where Carmen stands. So where do we go? Somewhere that's not here, and not Odessa, and not anywhere Holloway would think to look. Eddie thought about this. He thought about the map, and the roads, and the empty places, and the not empty places, and about which category produced better outcomes when you were trying to disappear. Pecos, Eddie said. Pecos. Motel off the highway. The kind that doesn't ask questions. We stay there tonight, we figure out tomorrow. That's not a plan. It's the plan we have. They loaded the bags back into the equipment case at 6:15. The sun was setting. The sky had gone from orange to purple, and the temperature outside had dropped to 98, which in West Texas in June counted as cooling off. Eddie locked the safe house door behind them. He did not expect to come back. The house had served its purpose, which was to be a place between the bank and wherever they went next. And now they were going next, and the house could return to being what it had been before, which was empty. Eddie drove the Explorer. Mac followed in the Silverado. Luis rode passenger in the Explorer and said nothing. They took the dirt road back to Highway 385 and turned north instead of south, and ran the highway at 75 miles per hour through the dusk and into the dark. The traffic was light. They passed 2 trucks going the other direction, and a sedan that pulled out from a ranch road and fell in behind them for 3 miles before turning off. No law enforcement. No vehicles that sat on them long enough to suggest interest. Eddie's phone buzzed twice. He looked at it both times without answering. Carmen the first time. Holloway the second. He set the phone on the console and left it there and watched the highway and the empty land on both sides and thought about the two calls and what they meant, and whether the fact that Carmen and Holloway were both calling within 10 minutes of each other was coincidence or coordination. He decided it was coordination. He decided this meant what he'd been afraid it meant since the motel room in Midland, which was that Carmen and Holloway had something between them that Eddie was not part of, and that the something had moved past conversation into action. "She's with him," Eddie said. Luis looked at him. "What?" "Carmen. She's with Holloway." "You don't know that." "I know she's calling right after he calls. I know they've been talking. I know he looks at her, and she looks at him, and I'm in the room, and they act like I'm not." Luis said nothing. He looked out the window, at the dark desert running past. "You think I'm wrong?" Eddie said. "I think you're tired, and you're stressed, and you just robbed a bank and shot a man. I shot a man. And we're driving to Pecos with $360,000 in the back, and you're looking for problems because problems are easier to see than what's actually happening." "What's actually happening?" "I don't know," Luis said. "But I don't think Carmen's the problem." Eddie thought about this. He thought about whether Luis was right, or whether Luis was saying what he wanted to hear, because saying it made the drive easier. He thought about Carmen in the rental house the night before the job, and the kiss, and the way she'd looked at him in the dark, and whether any of that had been real or whether all of it had been performance. He decided he did not know. He decided not knowing was worse than knowing, because not knowing meant he had to operate on assumptions, and assumptions got people killed. They drove. Pecos appeared on the horizon at 8:30, a scatter of lights in the dark, a town that existed because the highway ran through it, and because oil moved through it, and because people needed places to stop between El Paso and Midland. Eddie took the exit for Highway 285 and ran south into town and found a motel called the Western Star that had a neon sign out front showing a cowboy on a horse and rooms that rented for $40 a night cash. He parked at the back of the lot. Mac parked beside him. They got out, and Eddie went to the office and paid for 2 rooms with cash from his wallet and came back with 2 keys and handed one to Mac. "We're in 14 and 15, Eddie said. "We bring the bags inside. We lock the doors. We don't go out. We don't make calls. We wait until morning, and we figure out what's next." "What about food?" Luis said. "There's a vending machine by the office. You want food, get it from there." Luis looked at the motel. He looked at the rooms. He looked at Eddie. "How long are we staying here?" "As long as it takes." "As long as what takes?" "As long as it takes to figure out if Carmen and Holloway are coming for us, or if I'm wrong about them. And if they are." Eddie picked up the equipment case from the Explorer's cargo area. He carried it toward room 14. "Then we move the money again, and we keep moving it until they stop looking, or until we're far enough away that looking doesn't matter." "That's not a plan," Luis said. "It's the plan we have," Eddie said again. He unlocked the door to room 14 and went inside and set the equipment case on the bed and stood in the center of the room and looked at the walls and the window and the parking lot beyond it and thought about Holloway and Carmen and the distance between Pecos and Odessa and whether $40 a night and a neon cowboy were enough to keep $360,000 safe for one more night. He decided they were not. He decided it did not matter. This was where they were. This was the decision he'd made. He would live with it until morning, And then he would make the next decision, and the decision after that, and he would keep making decisions until the decisions stopped producing options and he ran out of road. He sat on the bed next to the equipment case and pulled out his phone and looked at the 2 missed calls and thought about calling Carmen back and asking her directly whether she was with Holloway and whether they were coming for the money. He decided not to call. He decided calling would tell her where he was, and telling her where he was would produce outcomes he could not control. And the only thing he had left was control. He turned off the phone. He lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of the highway beyond the parking lot and the hum of the air conditioning unit under the window, and thought about the job and the money and Carmen and whether any of this had been worth it. He did not have an answer. He closed his eyes and waited for morning. Chapter 4. Eddie woke at 6 in the morning to the sound of a semi shifting gears on the highway. The room was still dark. The air conditioning had been running all night, and the temperature inside was cold enough that Eddie could see his breath when he exhaled. He sat up. The equipment case was still on the bed beside him, where he'd left it. He unzipped it and looked at the 6 bags and zipped it closed again. He went to the window and pulled the curtain back an inch. The parking lot was empty, except for the Explorer and Mac's Silverado. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon. The sky to the east was beginning to lighten from black to gray. Eddie's phone was still off. He turned it on. It powered up and connected to the network and immediately buzzed with notifications. 3 missed calls from Carmen, 2 from Holloway, 1 text from Carmen that read, "Where are you?" He did not respond. He went to the bathroom and washed his face and looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man who had not slept well and who looked older than he had looked 2 days ago. The job had aged him. Or the decision to do the job. Or the decisions that had followed the job. He could not tell which, and it did not matter. He went back to the main room and sat on the bed and thought about the options. Stay in Pecos another day. Move the money somewhere else. Go back to Odessa and confront Carmen directly. Each option had problems. Each option had outcomes he could not control. He decided on Odessa. He decided this because the not knowing was worse than the knowing, and because staying at a motel in Pecos was not a solution, but a delay, and delays did not make problems smaller. Mac knocked on the door at 7:15. Eddie let him in. Mac looked at the equipment case on the bed, and at Eddie, and appeared to read something in Eddie's face that told him the decision had been made. "We're going back," Mac said. "We're going back." "When?" "Tonight. After dark. We take back roads. We don't use the highway." Mac sat in the chair by the window. "You call Carmen?" "No." "You going too?" "No." "So we just show up." "We just show up," Eddie said. "And we see what happens." Mac thought about this. He looked at Eddie with the assessing quality of someone who is trying to decide whether the decision being made is the right decision, or whether it is the decision that feels right, because all the other options feel worse. "You think she's there?" "At the house." "I think she's there, or she's with Holloway. Either way, we're going to find out." "And if she's with Holloway?" Eddie looked at the equipment case. "Then we take the money, and we leave and we don't come back." "Where do we go?" "Somewhere that's not Texas." Mac stood. He went to the door and stopped with his hand on the knob. "Eddie." "Yeah." "If this goes bad?" "It's already bad." "If it goes worse," Mac said. "If Holloway's there, or if Carmen set us up, or if this turns into something we can't walk away from, then we deal with it." "How?" Eddie looked at Mac. "However we have to." They left Pecos at 8:30 after the sun had cleared the horizon and the temperature had climbed to 94. Eddie drove the Explorer. Mac followed in the Silverado. Luis rode passenger and said nothing. He had said nothing since they'd left the Western Star, except to ask where they were going. And when Eddie had told him Odessa, Luis had nodded and returned to looking out the window at the desert. They did not take Highway 385. Eddie took back roads, county roads that ran through ranch land and oil fields, and the empty places between towns where the only traffic was pickups hauling equipment and tanker trucks moving water. The roads were two-lane blacktop, no shoulders, the kind of roads where you saw another vehicle coming from 2 miles away, and where being seen meant being remembered. They saw 4 vehicles in 3 hours. None of them was law enforcement. Eddie's phone buzzed twice more. Carmen both times. He did not answer. He watched the road and the mirrors and thought about what he would say to Carmen when he saw her, and whether saying it would change anything, or whether the thing between them had already moved past the point where words mattered. They reached Odessa at 11:40. Eddie took the east side streets and came at the rental house from the back through the neighborhood, avoiding the main roads. He pulled into the carport at 11:47 p.m. The lights were on inside. Carmen's white Civic sat in the driveway, the Padre Island bumper sticker visible on the rear panel, the car that had been there every night for 18 months, and that Eddie had stopped noticing in the way you stop noticing things that are always there. Mac pulled the Silverado to the curb and parked on the street. Eddie told him to wait. Mac nodded. Eddie and Luis got out of the Explorer. Eddie carried the equipment case. They walked to the front door. Eddie unlocked it. Carmen was on the couch. She had a drink in her hand, bourbon it looked like, in a rocks glass with ice. She wore jeans and a black t-shirt and had her hair down, and she looked at Eddie and at Luis and at the equipment case, and her face showed something Eddie could not read, which was either relief or guilt, or the specific combination of both that people show when they have been waiting for something and the something has just arrived. "How bad?" Carmen said. "We're clear. I saw the news. They're saying Pierce is in critical condition. He's alive. They're also saying they have descriptions. They're saying it's only a matter of time." Eddie set the equipment case on the coffee table. "Ray called you." Carmen looked at her drink. "He called." "What did he say?" "He said he's coming by. He said he wants his cut." "When?" "He didn't say." Eddie opened the equipment case. The 6 canvas bags sat inside, the contractor names visible on the tags. He pulled one bag out and set it on the coffee table. Then another. Then all 6. They sat in a row like evidence. Carmen looked at the bags. "How much?" "Enough." She stood. She set her drink on the side table and walked to the kitchen and came back with 2 more glasses and a bottle of bourbon. She poured 3 fingers into each glass, no ice, and handed one to Eddie and one to Luis. "To the score," Carmen said. She drank. Eddie drank. Luis drank. The bourbon tasted wrong. Eddie noticed this immediately. Not wrong in the way that bourbon tastes wrong when you're not used to it, but wrong in the way that things taste wrong when something has been added to them. He looked at Carmen. She was watching him. She was watching him with the focused attention of someone waiting to see if something is going to happen, and who knows exactly what the something is. Eddie set the glass down. "What was in that?" "Bourbon," Carmen said. "What else?" Eddie. "What else, Carmen?" She did not answer. She looked at the floor. She looked at the bags on the coffee table. She looked at Eddie, and her face had changed from the thing it had been to something else, which was resignation, which was the face of someone who has made a decision and who has to live with it and who has just realized that living with it is going to be harder than making it. Luis set his glass down. He looked at Carmen. He looked at Eddie. What did she give us? I don't know, Eddie said. There was a knock on the door. Eddie went to the door. He knew what was on the other side before he opened it. He knew because the bourbon had tasted wrong, and because Carmen had been waiting, and because the knock had come at exactly the moment when it would do the most damage. He opened the door anyway, because opening it was the only option left. Holloway stood on the porch. He had his badge clipped to his belt, and his service weapon on his right hip in a leather holster, and the posture of a man who has already decided how this is going to end, and who is no longer interested in alternatives. Behind him in the street, 2 Ector County Sheriff's Patrol units, light bars dark, parked at angles that blocked the road. 4 deputies stood beside the units with their hands near their weapons. Eddie looked at the deputies. He looked at Mac's Silverado on the curb. One of the deputies had his hand on Mac's driver's window and was saying something. Mac had both hands visible on the steering wheel. Holloway said, "Eddie Vance, you're under arrest for armed robbery and attempted murder." He said it without inflection, without theater, with the procedural flatness of a man reading a script he has read so many times that the words have stopped having meaning beyond their function, which is to mark the transition from one state to another, from free to not free, from before to after. Eddie did not move. He looked at Holloway. He looked past Holloway at the patrol units, and at Mac and the Silverado, and at the deputies who were now moving toward the house with the coordinated precision of men who have done this before and who are following a plan. "You carrying?" Holloway said. "No." "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Eddie turned around. Holloway cuffed him. The cuffs were tight. Eddie felt them close around his wrists with the specific pressure that communicates finality. Holloway walked him out onto the porch, and Eddie looked back through the doorway at Carmen standing in the living room, and at Luis sitting on the couch, and at the 6 canvas bags on the coffee table. Carmen met his eyes. She held the look for a moment, and then looked away. Holloway called to one of the deputies. "Miller. Inside. Secure the evidence." A deputy came up the porch steps and went into the house. Eddie watched him go to the coffee table and look at the bags and then look at Holloway, and Holloway nodded, and the deputy began loading the bags into a large canvas duffel that he'd brought with him from the patrol unit. The duffel was not an evidence bag. Evidence bags had labels and serial numbers and chain of custody documentation. The duffel was plain canvas with no markings, and it had come from the bed of Holloway's personal truck, which Eddie could see parked behind the patrol units, a white F-250 with a contractor rack and mud on the wheel wells. Eddie watched the deputy load the bags. He watched Holloway watch the deputy load the bags. He watched Carmen stand in the living room with her drink and not look at any of it. "Carmen," Eddie said. She looked at him. "How long?" She understood what he was asking. She understood, and she appeared to decide that lying at this point would be worse than the truth. 2 months, she said. 2 months. "I'm sorry." "Are you?" Carmen did not answer. Holloway stepped between them and put his hand on Carmen's shoulder in a gesture that was partly protective and partly possessive, and that answered the question Eddie had been asking since the motel in Midland. The gesture said, "She's with me." The gesture said, "She's been with me." The gesture said, "You never had her, you just thought you did." Eddie looked at Holloway's hand on Carmen's shoulder. He looked at Carmen's face. He looked at the living room and the couch and the coffee table where they'd planned the job 3 weeks ago, and where the bags had been, and where now there was nothing. Holloway walked Eddie to the patrol car. He opened the rear door and put his hand on Eddie's head and guided him into the back seat the way cops guide people into back seats, with the practiced efficiency of repetition. He closed the door. Eddie sat in the back seat and looked through the window at the house. The deputy, Miller, carried the duffel out of the house and walked it to Holloway's F-250. Holloway opened the tailgate, and Miller loaded the duffel into the truck bed, and Holloway covered it with a blue tarp and secured the tarp with bungee cords. Eddie watched this through the patrol car window. He watched Holloway and Miller work together with the coordination of men who have discussed this in advance and who are executing a plan that has nothing to do with evidence or procedure or any of the things that arrests are supposed to involve. Carmen came out of the house. She stood on the porch and watched Holloway secure the tarp. She did not look at Eddie. She walked to her Civic and got in and started the engine and pulled out of the driveway and followed Holloway's F-250 as it turned left onto the street and headed west toward the highway. Eddie watched them go. He watched the taillights fade and disappear, and he thought about the 2 months Carmen had said, and about what had been happening during those 2 months while Eddie had been planning the job and recruiting the crew and believing that Carmen was his and that the job was clean and that the split would happen the way he'd planned it. He thought about the kiss the night before the job and whether it had meant goodbye or whether it had meant nothing at all. He decided it had meant goodbye. He decided this made it worse. The deputy driving the patrol car got in and started the engine. The air conditioning came on. The deputy pulled away from the curb, and Eddie looked back at the rental house one more time. The carport where the '68 Charger sat under the blue tarp, the dead lawn, the stucco walls, the place he'd lived for 18 months and that he would never see again. He thought about the Charger's trunk and the false bottom and the $38,000 in cash from a previous job that Carmen did not know about and that Holloway did not know about, and that would sit there until someone bought the car at auction and found it. He thought about whether $38,000 was enough to hire a lawyer who could do more than plead him down. He decided it probably was not. They took Luis out in a second patrol car. Eddie watched through the window as 2 deputies walked Luis from the house to the car and put him in the back seat. Luis looked small between the 2 deputies. He looked like someone who had made a series of decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time, and that had led him to a place he had not expected and could not now leave. The second patrol car pulled away. Mac was still in the Silverado. A deputy stood beside the driver's window with his hand on his weapon, and Mac sat with both hands on the steering wheel and did not move. Eddie could not see Mac's face from this angle, but he knew what it looked like, which was the face of a man doing math, working out whether there was a version of this situation that ended with him driving away, or whether all versions ended with him in the back of a patrol car next to Luis. Mac appeared to decide the math did not work in his favor. The deputy opened the Silverado's door and told Mac to step out. Mac stepped out. The deputy cuffed him. They walked him to a third patrol car. Eddie watched all of this through the window of his own patrol car and thought about the crew he'd assembled and the job they'd pulled and the money they'd taken and the fact that none of them had the money now and all of them were in custody, and the only people who had walked away were the 2 people Eddie should have seen coming and did not. He thought about this until thinking about it stopped producing anything useful. The patrol car pulled onto Highway 385, heading north toward the Ector County Jail. The deputy driving was young, late 20s maybe, clean-cut, the kind of cop who still believed the job was about right and wrong, and who had not yet learned that the job was mostly paperwork and waiting, and the specific exhaustion that comes from seeing the same people make the same mistakes. The deputy did not speak to Eddie. Eddie did not expect him to. They drove in silence. The highway ran straight through the dark. The oil rigs burned their flare stacks on both sides of the road. The pump jacks moved in their slow, mechanical rhythm. The desert was empty and vast and indifferent to all of it. Eddie looked out the window at the desert and thought about the sequence of decisions that had brought him here. He thought about the motel in Midland, and the crew and the bank and Pierce going down, and the drive to the safe house, and the call from Holloway, and the decision to go back to Odessa instead of running. He thought about whether any single decision, changed, would have produced a different outcome. He decided it would not. Carmen and Holloway had been building this since the first night at the Cactus Rose. Eddie had been the vehicle, the plan, the crew, the execution. Carmen had been the access point. Holloway had been the authority that made the arrest look legitimate. The job had been real. The split had not. The patrol car took the exit for the county jail. Eddie had been to this jail before. He knew the intake process. He knew the holding cells. He knew what came next in the way that men who have done time know what comes next, which is that next looks exactly like before, except longer. The deputy pulled into the sally port. The gate closed behind them. The deputy got out and opened the rear door and told Eddie to step out. Eddie stepped out. His hands were still cuffed behind his back. The night air was warm. The temperature had dropped to 96. Above the jail, the West Texas sky was the particular depthless black of a place with no light pollution, and the stars were visible in the way they are visible only in the desert, which is to say, countless, indifferent, permanent. Eddie looked at the stars for a moment. Then the deputy walked him through the intake door into the fluorescent brightness of the processing area, and Eddie stopped looking at anything except the floor. Chapter 5. The processing area smelled of disinfectant and sweat, and the particular institutional air that all jails share, regardless of where they are, or how new they are, or what they promise about rehabilitation. Eddie had been through this process before. He knew the stations. He knew the sequence. He knew that everything that followed was designed to strip away the parts of you that were still free and replace them with the parts that belonged to the system. The desk sergeant was a man in his 50s with gray hair and a nameplate that read Morton. He looked at Eddie the way desk sergeants look at people being processed, which is to say, without interest, without judgment, with only the functional attention required to fill out the forms and move the line. Name, Morton said. Eddie Vance. Edward. Morton typed this into a computer that was running software from the 90s and that responded to each keystroke with a delay that suggested it had opinions about being asked to work. He typed for a minute without looking up. Then, "You been here before?" It was not a question. Morton was reading it off the screen. "Yeah," Eddie said. 2020. 3 years, Huntsville. Armed robbery. That's right. You're back. I'm back. Morton looked at Eddie for the first time since Eddie had come through the door. He looked at him with the specific weariness of a man who has processed thousands of people through this room, and who has seen the same patterns repeat, and who has stopped being surprised by any of it. "You learn anything the first time?" "I learned how long 3 years is," Eddie said. "Apparently not," Morton said. He took Eddie's fingerprints. He took Eddie's photograph, front and profile. The camera flashed bright in the fluorescent room. He inventoried Eddie's personal effects and logged them on a form. Wallet containing $83 cash, 1 driver's license, 1 debit card, 1 phone, 1 set of keys. Everything went into a manila envelope that Morton sealed and labeled and filed in a drawer behind the desk. "You get 1 phone call," Morton said. Eddie thought about this. He thought about who he would call and what the call would accomplish, and whether making the call was worth the information it would produce, or whether the information would cost more than the call. He thought about a lawyer. He thought about Mac. He thought about whether there was anyone in West Texas who would answer a call from the Ector County Jail at 1 in the morning, and who would do something with that answer that would change what was happening. He decided there was not. "I'll pass," Eddie said. Morton looked at him. "You sure?" "I'm sure. Most people use the call." "I'm not most people." Morton shrugged. He made a note on the form. "Your choice." The holding cell was on the second floor, at the end of a corridor that smelled of industrial floor cleaner and the compressed humanity of too many people in too small a space for too long. The cell had 4 bunks and 3 other men. 2 of them were asleep. One of them sat on the floor with his back against the wall and stared at nothing in the way that people stare at nothing when they have given up trying to stare at something. Eddie took the empty bunk. The mattress was thin and smelled of bleach, and the springs underneath it dug into his back when he lay down. He did not care. He had slept on worse. He had slept on concrete in Huntsville when the bunks were full, and he'd been new enough that taking the floor was the price you paid for being new. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was water-stained and cracked and had been painted over with institutional white that did not quite cover the stains. The fluorescent lights hummed. They never turned off. Eddie remembered this from before. The lights stayed on all night, and you learned to sleep through them or you did not sleep. He thought about Carmen. He thought about the kiss the night before the job and whether it had been real or performance. He thought about the 2 months she'd said, and what had been happening during those 2 months while he'd been planning and recruiting and believing that she was his. He thought about Holloway's hand on her shoulder, and the way she'd looked at the floor when Holloway had arrested him, and the way she'd gotten in her Civic and followed Holloway's truck west without looking back. He thought about whether she'd felt anything when she'd poured the bourbon, or whether it had been just another step in a sequence she'd been following since the day Holloway had first sat down at the cactus rose and looked at her, and she'd looked back. He decided it had been a sequence. He decided this meant she'd felt nothing, or that what she'd felt had been so small compared to $360,000 that the feeling had not mattered. He thought about Pierce. He thought about the retired Texas Ranger lying on the tile floor of First National Bank with his shirt turning dark below the ribs and his breathing fast and shallow. He thought about whether Pierce had made it out of surgery and whether he was alive right now in a hospital bed at Medical Center Hospital, or whether he died on the table, and Eddie and Luis and Mac were looking at murder charges instead of armed robbery. He thought about how much difference that made in practical terms, which was the difference between 20 years and life, which was a difference that mattered to sentencing guidelines, but not to Eddie, who was 42, and for whom 20 years was the same as life, because both numbers ended the same way, which was, he would die in prison. He thought about Luis. Luis would fold. Luis was not built for this. Luis was built for systems and computers and problems that had technical solutions, and prison was not a technical problem. Prison was a human problem. When the DA came to Luis with a deal, testify against Eddie and Mac, we'll knock it down to accessory, you do 5 instead of 20, Luis would take the deal. Luis would take it because 5 years was survivable, and 20 was not, and because Luis had a life outside this that was worth returning to. Eddie did not blame him for this. He would have done the same. He thought about Mac. Mac would hold. Mac had done 2 tours in Iraq and 18 months in Huntsville, and the things that broke most people did not break Mac, because Mac had been broken before, and had learned that broken was a condition you operated from rather than a condition that stopped you. Mac would sit in his own holding cell 3 floors down and would say nothing to anyone. And when the DA came with a deal, Mac would tell him to go to hell and would take whatever the court gave him and would do his time the way he'd done his time before, which was one day at a time until the days added up to release. Eddie thought about the crew he'd assembled and the job they'd pulled, and the fact that none of them had the money now, and all of them were in custody, and whether this outcome had been inevitable or whether there had been a version of the job that ended differently. He decided there had not been. Carmen and Holloway had been building this for 2 months. Eddie had been building the job for 3 weeks. The math had never worked in Eddie's favor. The question was whether Eddie had known this and ignored it, or whether he had genuinely believed that Carmen was his and that the job was clean, and that the split would happen the way he'd planned. He decided he had believed it. He decided this made him stupid rather than unlucky, which was worse. He thought about Carmen and Holloway, somewhere in West Texas right now with $360,000 in the bed of an F-250. He thought about where they were going, and what they were thinking, and whether they were talking about him or whether they had already moved past him to the next thing, which was the border and the money, and what $360,000 could buy in a place where dollars bought more than they bought here. They were thinking about Mexico. They were thinking about a beach town on the Pacific coast where Americans were common enough not to draw attention, and where questions were rare, and where cash was the language that everyone spoke, and that required no translation. They were thinking about a house on the beach, and a life that looked nothing like Odessa, and about whether $360,000 was enough to sustain that life for a year or 2 or 5 before they had to think about work again. Eddie thought about the fact that Holloway was a cop, and that cops who stole from cops got found eventually. He thought about the fact that Holloway had made an enemy of every law enforcement agency in West Texas by taking the money and running, and that agencies did not forget and did not forgive, and that sooner or later someone would pull a thread and the thread would lead to Holloway, and Holloway would have to answer questions he could not answer. He thought about the fact that Carmen was with Holloway because Holloway had the money, and that when the money ran low or when Holloway became a liability, Carmen would make the same calculation about Holloway that she had made about Eddie, which was the calculation that asked, what is this person worth to me versus what this person costs me? He thought about how that calculation would go for Holloway. He thought it would not go well. This did not make him feel better, but it made him feel something, which was more than he had expected to feel lying on a thin mattress in a holding cell at 2 in the morning with fluorescent lights humming and 3 other men breathing in the dark. He thought about the $38,000 in the Charger's trunk. He thought about the false bottom he'd installed 2 years ago, and the cash from a previous job that he'd never told Carmen about, because telling her would have produced questions, and questions would have produced conversations, and conversations would have produced opportunities for things to go wrong. He thought about whether the $38,000 would still be there when he got out. He thought about whether the rental house would go to auction, and whether someone would buy the Charger, and whether that someone would find the false bottom, or whether the car would sit in storage for months or years, gathering dust and rust and the specific decay that happens to cars when they stop being driven. He thought about whether $38,000 was enough to hire a lawyer who could do more than plead him down. He thought about the kind of lawyer you could hire for $38,000 and the kind of lawyer you needed when you were facing 20 years for armed robbery and attempted murder, and whether those 2 categories overlapped. He decided they did not. He thought about Huntsville and the 3 years he'd done there and the 3 years he'd been out, and the fact that the second stretch was always longer than the first because the second stretch you did with the knowledge of what you were going back to. The first time you went in, you had hope. The first time you believed that time moved, and that years ended, and that release was a real thing that happened to real people. The second time, you knew better. The second time you knew that time moved, but that it moved in a way that made days feel like weeks and weeks feel like months, and that release was a thing that happened to other people and not to you. He thought about 42 plus 20 and arrived at 62, which was a number that meant different things to different people, but which meant to Eddie Vance, lying on a mattress in the Ector County Jail on a June night in West Texas, that he would be an old man when he got out, if he got out at all. He thought about this until thinking about it stopped producing anything except the same conclusion repeated, which was that he had done this to himself, and that no one had forced him, and that the job had been his idea, and the crew had been his crew, and the decision to go back to Odessa had been his decision, and that all of it added up to this: a holding cell, a thin mattress, fluorescent lights that never turned off, and the rest of his life measured in years he did not have. One of the men in the cell woke up and went to the toilet in the corner and urinated and came back to his bunk without speaking. The sound echoed in the cell. The man went back to sleep. Eddie lay on his back and listened to the breathing of 3 men and the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a television in another part of the jail playing something that no one was watching. He thought about the sequence of events that had brought him to this moment. He thought about the motel in Midland, and the crew, and the planning, and the 3 run-throughs, and the bank, and Pierce, and the shooting, and the safe house, and the call from Holloway, and the decision to go to Pecos, and the decision to go back to Odessa, and the knock on the door at 12:03 a.m., and Carmen's face when she'd said 2 months, and Holloway's hand on her shoulder. He thought about whether any single decision, changed, would have produced a different outcome. He thought about this for a long time. He decided it would not have mattered. Carmen and Holloway had been building this since the first night at the Cactus Rose, when Holloway had sat down at the bar and Carmen had leaned forward and they had started talking. Eddie had been the vehicle. The plan, the crew, the execution, all of it had been Eddie's work. And all of it had been moving toward this outcome since the moment Carmen had decided that $360,000 split 2 ways with a cop was better than $60,000 split 1 way with a man who had already done time and who was going to do more. The job had been real. The split had not. Eddie closed his eyes. He did not sleep. He lay in the dark with his eyes closed and listened to the sounds of the jail, and thought about double crosses and the people who pulled them, and the people who took the fall. He thought about the fact that he had taken the fall before, and that he was taking it again, and that this appeared to be the thing he was built for, which was not planning jobs or assembling crews or executing on ideas, but taking falls, absorbing blame, sitting in cells while other people walked away with money. He thought about Carmen walking away. He thought about Holloway walking away. He thought about the $38,000 in the Charger's trunk that no one knew about and that would sit there waiting for someone who was not Eddie to find it. He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling, the water stains, the cracks, the institutional white paint that did not quite cover what was underneath, the fluorescent lights that hummed with the persistence of things that have been humming for so long they have forgotten how to stop. He thought about the West Texas desert outside the jail, the empty land, the oil rigs, the flare stacks burning off gas in the dark, the highways that ran straight to horizons that never arrived, the towns scattered across the emptiness like somebody had thrown dice, the heat that pressed down on everything during the day, and the cold that came at night when the heat finally let go. He thought about the people who lived in this country, and the people who left, and the people who stayed because they had nowhere else to go, or because they had decided that nowhere else was worth going to. He thought about which category he belonged to. He decided he belonged to the category of people who stayed because they had run out of options, which was different from the people who stayed because they wanted to, but which produced the same outcome, which was, you were here and here was where you remained. The fluorescent lights hummed. The three men breathed. The television played in another part of the jail. Eddie lay on the mattress and waited for morning. Morning came at 6:15 when a guard opened the cell door and called names from a clipboard. Eddie's name was on the list. They took him downstairs to an interview room where a public defender was waiting, a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and a briefcase that had seen better days. She introduced herself. Her name was Lisa Granger. She had been assigned to his case 30 minutes ago. She had not yet reviewed the file. She had questions. Eddie answered them. She took notes. She told him what came next, which was arraignment and bail hearing, and the slow machinery of the court system grinding through motions and delays, and the eventual plea deal that everyone knew was coming but that required 6 months of pretending it was not. She asked him if he had anything to say. Eddie thought about this. He thought about what there was to say, and to whom, and whether saying it would change anything about what was happening or what would happen. He decided it would not. "No," Eddie said. "Nothing. Nothing." Granger closed her briefcase. "The DA's going to offer a deal. Armed robbery, you're looking at 20 years. If Pierce dies, it's murder, and you're looking at life. But if you cooperate—" "I'm not cooperating, Mr. Vance." "I'm not cooperating," Eddie said again. "I did the job. I take the time. That's how this works." Granger looked at him with the specific weariness of a public defender who has had this conversation before, and who knows how it ends, and who is too tired to argue about it. "That's not how this works. That's how you think it works. What actually happens is you go to trial, you lose, you get the maximum, and you spend the rest of your life in prison because you had a principle." "Then that's what happens," Eddie said. Granger stood. She picked up her briefcase. "I'll see you at arraignment." She left. The guard came back and took Eddie upstairs to a different cell, a single this time, because arraignment was in 3 hours and they were keeping the arraignment prisoners separate. Eddie sat on the bunk and looked at the wall and thought about what Granger had said and whether she was right. He decided she was right. He decided it did not matter. The arraignment was at 10 in the morning in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and floor wax, and the accumulated weight of every decision that had been made in that room for the past 40 years. Eddie stood in orange coveralls with his hands cuffed in front of him and listened to the charges. Armed robbery. Attempted murder. The judge asked how he pleaded. "Not guilty," Eddie said. The judge set bail at $500,000. Eddie did not have $500,000. Eddie did not have $500. The judge remanded him to the Ector County Jail pending trial. The whole thing took 6 minutes. They took him back to the cell. He sat on the bunk and looked at the wall and thought about Carmen and Holloway and the border and the beach town and the $360,000 and whether they had made it to Mexico yet or whether they were still in Texas waiting for the right moment to cross. He thought about the fact that he would never know. He thought about the fact that not knowing was worse than knowing, but that both outcomes ended the same way, which was, he was here and they were there, and the distance between here and there was measured in years rather than miles. He lay back on the bunk. He closed his eyes. He thought about the $38,000 in the Charger's trunk, and whether it would still be there when he got out, and whether getting out was something that would happen in years or decades or at all. He thought about Mac in another cell, and Luis in another cell, and the crew he'd assembled, and the job they'd pulled, and the money they'd taken, and the fact that none of them had the money now, and all of them were in custody, and the only people who had walked away were the 2 people Eddie should have seen coming. He thought about double crosses, and the people who pulled them, and the people who took the fall. He thought about the fact that he was, once again, the person who took the fall. He thought about this until thinking about it stopped producing anything useful. Then he stopped thinking about it. He lay on the bunk and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the jail. Doors opening and closing, voices in the corridors, the television playing somewhere, the hum of the air conditioning that ran all day and all night, and that produced a sound that was the sound of time passing without going anywhere. He waited. The ceiling had the same water stains as the holding cell, the same cracks, the same institutional white paint that did not quite cover what was underneath. The fluorescent lights hummed. Eddie closed his eyes and waited for whatever came next. The end.